Something shifted inside Team USA long before fans noticed it on the court. It wasn't announced. There was no press release. But behind closed doors, people started realizing that a line had been crossed. One conversation, one uncomfortable truth. And suddenly, a player who once felt completely untouchable was being looked at differently. Paige Bueckers didn't suddenly lose her skills. She didn't stop working. But after a certain revelation came out, her position inside the Team USA conversation quietly changed. And most fans still don't understand why. Because this wasn't about basketball. It was about power, perception, and timing. And once those things shift, even the biggest stars aren't safe. But to understand how Paige ended up here, you have to go back to when her place in the sport felt absolutely guaranteed. For a long stretch of time, Paige Bueckers didn't feel like just another star in women's basketball. She felt protected. Not in an obvious way, but in the way systems quietly shield the people they trust most. From the moment she arrived on the national stage, everything around her aligned almost perfectly. Coaches saw a player who understood structure. Media saw a personality they could comfortably build narratives around. Sponsors saw someone who represented excellence without controversy. That combination is rare, and when it appears, programs hold onto it tightly. Paige's game was clean, controlled, and efficient. She didn't rely on chaos or spectacle. She didn't force moments. She fit into systems instead of bending them. And for USA basketball, that mattered just as much as raw talent. Her style mirrored the identity the program had spent years cultivating. Disciplined, team first, dependable under pressure. When people talked about the future of the sport, her name wasn't debated. It was assumed. That sense of inevitability followed her everywhere. When Paige played well, it was framed as confirmation. When she struggled, it was framed as temporary. There was always an underlying belief that she would be fine because she was supposed to be. That's a level of trust very few athletes ever experience. And it shaped how her career unfolded at every level. Opportunities didn't feel earned through noise or controversy. They arrived naturally, as if they were always part of the plan. Inside elite basketball circles, perception is everything, and Paige's perception was flawless. She was viewed as someone who elevated any room she walked into. Someone you could build around without worrying about backlash or unpredictability. When decision-makers discussed long-term plans, Paige fit comfortably into every version of the future. She didn't challenge the system. She reinforced it. That's why her presence felt permanent. Even as new talent emerged, Paige remained the reference point. Other players were compared to her, not the other way around. Her success became the standard. And when fans talked about Team USA rosters years in advance, her name was already penciled in. Not because of favoritism, but because she represented everything the program valued. And that distinction matters. Because being valued for how well you fit the system is different from being valued for how much you change it. Paige was never positioned as a disruptor. She was positioned as a stabilizer. The player who kept things steady while the sport grew around her. That role came with benefits, but it also came with an unspoken risk. If the system ever changed, the people who benefited most from the old structure would feel it first. For a long time, no one thought that would happen. Women's basketball had evolved gradually for decades. Growth was steady, predictable, and controlled. The same pathways produced stars. The same institutions shaped narratives. And Paige thrived within that environment. Her rise didn't force uncomfortable conversations. It didn't expose weaknesses. It confirmed that everything was working as intended. But beneath that stability, something else was forming. Attention patterns were shifting. Younger fans were consuming the sport differently. Highlights were spreading faster than traditional coverage could keep up with. And the idea of who could carry the sport forward was becoming less about fitting in and more about standing out. Quietly at first, then all at once. Paige didn't do anything wrong during this period. That's the part that often gets overlooked. She kept playing her game. She kept leading. She kept representing the sport with professionalism. But while she stayed consistent, the center of gravity began moving elsewhere. And consistency, in a changing landscape, doesn't always protect you. Because when systems evolve, they don't announce it. They don't warn the people who benefited most from the old order. The shift happens gradually, then suddenly. And by the time it's obvious, the rules have already changed. Paige's untouchable status wasn't built on dominance alone. It was built on alignment. Alignment with coaches, media narratives, branding, and tradition. And once that alignment stopped being the most valuable asset in the room, everything around her started to feel less certain. Most fans didn't notice it at first. There were no headlines, no dramatic moments, just small changes in how conversations sounded, slight differences in how stories were framed, subtle hesitations where confidence used to be automatic. These weren't signs of decline. They were signs of transition. And transitions don't care how secure you once felt. Because while Paige was still being respected, someone else was beginning to command something even more powerful than respect: attention. And that shift would change everything. While Paige Bueckers represented stability, Caitlin Clark represented disruption. And not the kind that fades after a few highlights. This was the kind that forces people in power to pay attention whether they want to or not. From the outside, it looked like a scoring surge. But inside the sport, it felt like something much bigger was happening. Caitlin wasn't just putting up numbers. She was pulling the game into places it had never gone before. Crowds weren't just watching her play. They were showing up because of her. Arenas sold out weeks in advance. Ratings jumped the moment her name was on the schedule. Clips of her shots didn't just circulate among basketball fans. They spread to people who had never followed the women's game at all. That kind of attention changes how decisions get made. Unlike previous stars, Caitlin didn't rise quietly through established channels. She bypassed them. Her impact didn't depend on traditional approval. The audience had already chosen her. And once that happens, systems lose leverage. Because it's one thing to promote a player. It's another thing to react to one who no longer needs promotion. Her style only amplified that effect. Deep shots, high-risk plays, confidence that bordered on defiance. Caitlin didn't just execute within the game. She challenged expectations of how it was supposed to look. And with every viral moment, the old assumptions about what women's basketball needed to succeed started falling apart. Inside Team USA circles, this created tension almost immediately. Not because Caitlin wasn't talented. No one could deny that. The issue was fit. Her game didn't naturally conform to the system. It demanded attention. It bent spacing. It shifted hierarchy. And most importantly, it shifted narrative control away from institutions and toward the player herself. That's a dangerous position for a program built on structure. For years, USA Basketball had been able to manage its stars carefully. Elevate some, slow down others, control messaging. Caitlin made that impossible. The numbers spoke too loudly. The crowds were too visible. Ignoring her wasn't an option anymore, but embracing her fully meant acknowledging that the old formula no longer worked. And that acknowledgement comes with consequences. Because when one player becomes the undeniable center of attention, it forces comparisons. It forces questions. And it forces uncomfortable realizations about who is driving the sport forward right now. Caitlin's rise didn't directly target Paige Bueckers, but it changed the context around her. Suddenly, being reliable wasn't enough. Being aligned wasn't enough. The spotlight was chasing something different. And Caitlin didn't shy away from it. She leaned into the moment with confidence that made some people uncomfortable. Not because she was disrespectful, but because she was unapologetic. She understood her impact, and she didn't pretend otherwise. That awareness alone set her apart. It signaled a new kind of star, one who didn't wait for permission to lead the conversation. As Caitlin's presence grew, so did the pressure inside Team USA. Decisions that once felt easy became complicated. How do you integrate a player who shifts the entire ecosystem? How do you keep control when the audience is already dictating the narrative? Those questions didn't have clean answers. And as the attention tilted more heavily toward Caitlin, it quietly took something away from others. Not their talent, not their accomplishments, but their centrality. The unspoken assumption that they would always be the focus. For Paige, that assumption had been the foundation of her security. And now, for the first time, it was being tested. Because when power shifts in sports, it rarely announces itself. It shows up in who gets talked about, who gets protected, and who suddenly has to prove things they never had to before. And Caitlin Clark had just changed all of that. At some point, the shift stopped being theoretical. It moved from whispers and tension into something much more direct. Caitlin Clark didn't call anyone out. She didn't name names. But what she said, and how she said it, landed heavier than any accusation could have. The message was simple but loaded. Recognition wasn't matching reality. Impact wasn't being acknowledged evenly. and certain opportunities were being distributed based on old expectations instead of what was actually happening on the court. It wasn't framed as a complaint. It was framed as an observation, and that made it harder to dismiss. Inside Team USA circles, that kind of honesty doesn't pass quietly. Some people took it as overdue. Others saw it as disruptive. Because when someone with that much attention speaks, it forces reflection. It exposes the gap between image and influence. And suddenly, conversations that had been avoided were happening whether anyone was ready or not. The uncomfortable part wasn't what Caitlin said. It was what everyone knew she was right about. Women's basketball was in a different place than it had been even a few years earlier. The audience was younger, louder, and less patient with tradition. They weren't tuning in because a system told them who to like. They were tuning in because someone made the game feel electric. And Caitlin had become the clearest symbol of that shift. That truth put pressure on the people making decisions. Because acknowledging it meant admitting that the old hierarchy no longer made sense. It meant reconsidering roles that had once felt permanent. And it meant accepting that some players, no matter how respected, might not carry the same weight they once did. Behind closed doors, reactions were mixed. There were people who believed the program needed to adapt immediately. Others worried about losing control. Not of the game, but of the narrative. Because once you admit the spotlight has moved, you can't easily move it back. And that creates winners and losers, whether anyone intends it or not. Paige Bueckers was never part of that conversation directly. But she didn't need to be. The truth Caitlin brought forward changed the context around everyone else. It reframed what mattered. And when that happens, players who once felt secure can suddenly feel exposed. Not because they did something wrong, but because the criteria quietly shifted beneath them. What made this moment especially tense was how subtle it was. There was no public fallout. No dramatic response. Everything stayed professional on the surface. But beneath that calm, priorities were being reevaluated. Conversations were being had that didn't include everyone they used to. And the energy inside the program began to feel different. This is how power moves in elite spaces. Not through confrontation, but through redefinition. Once the terms change, the outcomes follow naturally. And after Caitlin's truth entered the room, the terms were no longer the same. From the outside, nothing looked broken yet. But inside, the balance had already shifted. And what happened next would make that shift impossible to ignore. The change didn't arrive with a headline. That's what made it so easy to miss at first. Paige Bueckers wasn't benched. She wasn't criticized publicly. There was no announcement suggesting anything was wrong. But inside the program, the energy around her began to shift in ways that couldn't be explained by basketball alone. The first signs were small. Less certainty in how she was talked about. Fewer assumptions about her role being locked in. Language that once sounded confident became carefully neutral. These weren't demotions on paper. They were adjustments in tone. And at the highest level, tone tells you everything. Paige was still respected. Still admired. But respect isn't the same as priority. For the first time, she was being discussed as a variable instead of a constant. And that subtle shift carried weight. Because when elite programs stop treating you as inevitable, every decision around you becomes conditional. Nothing is guaranteed. Everything is being reevaluated. Injuries played a role, whether fair or not. Time away from the spotlight creates space, and in that space, narratives form. While Paige was sidelined, others filled the attention gap. Conversations moved on. And when she returned, she wasn't stepping back into the same environment she had left behind. The protection was gone. Moments that would have once been framed as temporary setbacks were now examined more closely. Questions that never used to surface started appearing quietly. Not accusations, just doubt. And doubt spreads faster than criticism because it feels reasonable. What made this especially difficult was how little Paige could control it. She wasn't underperforming. She wasn't creating problems. But perception had shifted, and perception doesn't wait for evidence to solidify. Once people start wondering instead of assuming, the damage is already happening. Behind the scenes, decisions began reflecting that uncertainty. Roster discussions became more complex. Roles were described with more flexibility. The idea of building around Paige no longer felt automatic. And while none of this was ever said publicly, players can feel when they're no longer at the center of a plan. Fans noticed something was off before they could articulate why. Paige was still present, but she wasn't central. She was still talented, but she wasn't framed as indispensable. And in a system like Team USA, that distinction is enormous. Because central players are protected. Peripheral ones are evaluated. This wasn't a fall from grace. It was a quiet repositioning. And those are often more painful because there's nothing to push back against. No statement to refute. No decision to appeal. Just a gradual realization that the ground beneath you isn't as solid as it used to be. Meanwhile, the spotlight elsewhere only grew brighter. And as attention concentrated around new energy, Paige's absence from that narrative became more noticeable. Not because she didn't belong, but because she was no longer being framed as the future. That realization set the stage for something even bigger. Because once image and influence start pulling in different directions, institutions are forced to choose. And Team USA was approaching that moment fast. At this level, basketball decisions are never just basketball decisions. Every roster move, every role, every public-facing choice is filtered through layers of branding, politics, and long-term strategy. Team USA doesn't just think about winning games. It thinks about image, influence, and control. And once Caitlin Clark's rise forced a new reality into the room, those priorities became impossible to separate. The program had always thrived on predictability. Familiar stars. Familiar narratives. A system that could be trusted to produce excellence without chaos. Paige Bueckers fit perfectly into that vision. She represented continuity. She allowed decision-makers to plan years ahead without worrying about volatility. But Caitlin introduced volatility in the most powerful way possible. Her presence didn't just bring attention, it redirected it. Sponsors started paying closer attention to where audiences were gathering. Broadcasters noticed which names moved numbers. Conversations that once centered around tradition began shifting toward reach. And reach is something institutions can't manufacture once the public has made up its mind. That created pressure from every direction. Executives want growth. Sponsors want visibility. Media wants moments. And fans want authenticity. Caitlin delivered all of that naturally. Paige, meanwhile, represented a model that had worked before, but no longer felt essential in the same way. This is where the politics quietly set in. Not in the form of arguments or ultimatums, but in competing interests. Some people wanted to lean fully into the new wave. Others wanted to slow it down, to integrate change without losing control. And caught in the middle were players whose value was being reassessed based on factors they couldn't influence. Paige didn't lose standing because she failed. She lost leverage because the equation changed. When branding enters the conversation, timing matters more than loyalty. Momentum matters more than history. And suddenly, being reliable isn't enough if you're not driving the biggest conversations. That doesn't mean Paige stopped being valuable. It means her value was being measured differently. Decisions started reflecting that shift. Not overtly, not publicly, but subtly in how future plans were discussed. In how certain players were positioned as cornerstones versus contributors. In how flexibility became more important than familiarity. These weren't personal judgments. They were strategic ones. And strategy doesn't always feel fair to the people affected by it. As Caitlin's influence continued to grow, Team USA found itself balancing two competing realities. One rooted in tradition and control. The other in momentum and audience demand. Fully embracing one meant sacrificing the other. And compromise, in situations like this, often leaves someone feeling sidelined. That's how Paige ended up in an uncomfortable position she never expected to be in. Still respected, still elite, but no longer central to every version of the future. Her name wasn't erased, it was repositioned. And in a program where hierarchy matters, repositioning can feel like rejection even when it's never labeled that way. This is the part fans rarely see. The decisions that shape narratives happen long before lineups are announced. And by the time outcomes become visible, the logic behind them has already been settled internally. By this point, the shift wasn't just happening. It had already happened. And what followed next made it impossible to ignore. No one ever came out and said Paige Bueckers was kicked out of Team USA. That's what made the reaction so explosive. Because the absence of an explanation created space for interpretation. And in modern sports, perception spreads faster than facts. From the outside, things stopped lining up. Paige wasn't being featured the same way. Her role felt unclear. Her presence in future conversations became conditional instead of assumed. And when fans looked for answers, they didn't get any. Silence filled the gap, and silence invites speculation. That's how the kicked-out narrative was born. Not from a single decision, but from a pattern. A gradual distancing that was impossible to point to, but impossible to ignore. In elite programs, exclusion rarely looks dramatic. It looks administrative. It looks strategic. And it almost always comes without a public explanation. What made this situation especially volatile was Paige's history. This was a player who had never been on the outside, who had always been framed as a pillar of the future. So when her status suddenly felt uncertain, fans didn't interpret it as normal roster fluidity. They interpreted it as rejection. Because when someone with that level of trust is quietly repositioned, it sends a message whether it's intended or not. The phrase kicked out spread because it captured the emotional reality, even if the technical details were more complex. Paige wasn't removed for performance reasons. She wasn't punished, but she was no longer being prioritized. And for fans, that distinction doesn't matter much. What they see is a star losing visibility without explanation. And that feels personal. Inside Team USA, this kind of move is rarely framed as exclusion. It's framed as flexibility, as keeping options open, as adapting to change. But for the players involved, the result is the same. Less certainty, less control, more questions. And Paige had no way to counter the narrative. Speaking out would only fuel it. Staying silent made it grow. And the longer the program avoided clarifying its direction, the more fans filled in the blanks themselves. Some blamed Caitlin Clark. Others blamed politics. Many blamed the system as a whole. What almost no one considered was that this was the natural result of a power shift that had already happened. When influence moves, institutions adjust. They don't always explain themselves. And they rarely acknowledge the people left in transition. That's how narratives like this gain traction. Because they reflect an emotional truth, even when the technical truth is more complicated. By the time the phrase kicked out became common online, the damage was already done. Paige's image had changed. Not because of her play, but because of how the situation was handled. And once perception hardens, it becomes part of the story whether anyone wants it to or not. And yet, this wasn't the end. Because the reaction to that narrative revealed something even bigger. Once the kicked-out narrative took hold, the conversation around women's basketball changed almost overnight. What had once been excitement around growth and momentum turned into debate, frustration, and sides being drawn. Paige Bueckers supporters felt blindsided. Caitlin Clark supporters felt defensive. And Team USA stayed quiet, letting the noise grow louder on its own. Social media became the battleground. Every clip, every interview, every roster update was dissected. Paige's absence or reduced visibility was treated as evidence. Caitlin's continued rise was treated as motive. And suddenly, two players who had never publicly clashed were being positioned against each other by fans desperate for an explanation. That divide didn't happen by accident. When institutions avoid transparency, fans create narratives to make sense of what they're seeing. And those narratives tend to be emotional, not measured. Paige was framed as the player who did everything right and still got pushed aside. Caitlin was framed as the disruptor who benefited from chaos. Neither version told the full story, but both spread fast. What made the situation even more volatile was how personal it felt to fans. Paige represented patience, loyalty, and trust in the system. Caitlin represented momentum, change, and unapologetic confidence. The argument wasn't just about basketball anymore. It was about what kind of future people wanted for the sport. Stability or evolution. Control or freedom. And once that line was drawn, there was no neutral ground. Every discussion turned into comparison. Every achievement by one player was framed as a loss for the other. That kind of environment benefits no one except the algorithms feeding off outrage. But for Team USA, it created a long-term problem they hadn't planned for. Chemistry isn't just built on the court. It's built on perception. And when the public believes there's tension, it eventually bleeds into reality, whether it's true or not. Players feel it. Coaches feel it. Every decision feels heavier because it's being interpreted through a narrative lens. Paige, once universally supported, now had to deal with doubt and speculation she never invited. Caitlin, once celebrated for her impact, now carried the weight of being blamed for a system-level shift she didn't control. Both players were being pulled into a conflict neither of them publicly created. And Team USA's silence only deepened the divide. By refusing to clarify, the program allowed fan narratives to harden into belief. What could have been framed as transition became framed as betrayal. And once fans feel betrayed, trust erodes fast. The real danger wasn't backlash. It was polarization. Because polarized fan bases don't move on easily. They remember. They hold grudges. And they question every future decision through the lens of past controversy. That's a risky position for any national program, especially one built on unity and shared purpose. By this point, the situation had grown beyond Paige and Caitlin. It became a referendum on how women's basketball handles growth, on whether rising stars are integrated or resisted, on whether loyalty is rewarded or quietly sidelined when the spotlight shifts. And that question still hasn't been answered. Because what happens next won't just shape these two careers. It will shape the direction of the sport itself. What often gets overlooked in stories like this is the psychological cost of being repositioned without explanation. Paige Bueckers never asked to be the center of controversy. She never pushed herself into debates about power or branding. And yet, she became one of the main symbols of a shift she didn't cause. That's a difficult place for any athlete to be. For someone who had always been rewarded for fitting the system, this moment created a kind of uncertainty she had never experienced before. Not knowing where you stand can be more damaging than being told outright. Because when clarity disappears, self-doubt fills the space. And elite athletes, no matter how composed they look, feel those shifts deeply. Paige had built her career on trust. Trust in coaches, trust in institutions, trust that doing things the right way would be enough. This situation quietly challenged that belief. Not in a dramatic way, but in a slow, unsettling one. The kind that makes you question whether loyalty is still valued when circumstances change. And unlike public criticism, this kind of pressure can't be defended against. There's no headline to respond to, no quote to clarify, just a growing sense that you're being evaluated by new standards that no one explained to you. For Paige, that meant navigating a space where her past achievements didn't guarantee future certainty anymore. This is the hidden cost of transition. When systems evolve, they often leave behind the people who helped build them, not out of malice, but out of momentum. The focus shifts forward, and anyone not aligned with that direction feels the drag immediately. Paige's situation became a quiet lesson in how fast stability can turn into vulnerability. And the hardest part? There was nothing she could do differently to stop it. Because this wasn't about effort or improvement. It was about timing, about being associated with an era that was ending while another was being celebrated. And no amount of professionalism can protect you from that kind of shift. By this point, Paige wasn't just dealing with competition on the court. She was navigating an identity change imposed from the outside. And that kind of challenge lingers longer than any injury. By the time the dust settled, one thing became clear to anyone paying close attention. This situation wasn't just about Paige Bueckers or Caitlin Clark. It was about Team USA standing at a crossroads it couldn't avoid anymore. For decades, the program had been the unquestioned center of women's basketball. It dictated standards. It defined greatness. Players adapted to it, not the other way around. But the sport had grown faster than the system that governed it. And Caitlin's rise made that impossible to ignore. Team USA now faced a new reality. The next generation of stars wouldn't automatically mold themselves to tradition. They would arrive with built-in audiences, personal brands, and influence that existed independently of national programs. That shifts leverage. And when leverage shifts, control becomes harder to maintain. This is where Paige's situation becomes symbolic. Her experience showed what happens when a system transitions without fully reconciling its past with its future. Loyal players can feel displaced. New stars can feel constrained. And the organization risks losing trust on both ends if it doesn't adapt transparently. From the outside, fans began asking harder questions. Who does Team USA actually build around now? Is it still about system fit, or is it about who moves the sport forward culturally? Can both coexist, or does one inevitably push the other aside? These aren't abstract debates anymore. They're shaping roster decisions in real time. And the answers won't just affect one Olympic cycle. They'll determine whether Team USA remains the defining authority in women's basketball, or whether it becomes just another participant in a sport now driven by players and audiences instead of institutions. For Paige, the future is still unwritten. Talent like hers doesn't disappear. But the path forward may look very different than what was once promised. For Caitlin, The challenge will be navigating influence without becoming boxed in by expectations she didn't create. And for Team USA, the pressure is mounting. Because the next move they make won't just be evaluated by wins and losses. It'll be judged by whether fans believe the program understands the era it's entering, or whether it's still trying to protect one that's already gone. And that decision is coming sooner than anyone wants to admit. When people look back at this moment in women's basketball, they won't remember it as a simple roster decision. They'll remember it as the point where the balance of power became impossible to ignore, where influence started to matter as much as talent, and where the rules quietly changed for everyone involved. Paige Bueckers didn't fail. She didn't fall off. She became part of a transition that no one prepared her for. A system she trusted began evolving without explaining the cost. And that's why this story resonates so deeply with fans. Because it exposes how quickly stability can disappear when narratives shift. Caitlin Clark didn't steal anything. She didn't push anyone out. She became undeniable in a moment where the sport was ready for something louder, bolder, and harder to control. And once that kind of momentum exists, institutions can either adapt or resist, but they can't stop it. Team USA now sits in the middle of that reality. Every future decision will be watched differently. Every omission will be questioned. And every new star will be evaluated not just on skill, but on influence. This isn't just a chapter in two careers. It's a warning about how power moves when the spotlight gets too big to manage quietly. And the most uncomfortable truth? This won't be the last time it happens. If you want to understand where basketball is really headed, not just what's shown on highlight reels, but what's happening behind the scenes, make sure you're subscribed. Because these stories don't stop here, and the next shift might be even bigger than this one. Stay ahead of it.